Healthy soil contains plenty of carbon, nutrients and moisture to help crops and pasture thrive. The carbon in soil is also an important factor in climate change. Globally, there's more carbon in soils than in all land-based plants and the atmosphere combined. So taking even a bit more carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil could be good for the climate, as well as your farm. But losing soil carbon has the opposite effect. Now, despite what you might have heard, it isn't that easy to increase soil carbon in New Zealand. Why is that?
I think that farmers have a very complex operation. They're trying to juggle how do we maintain production on our farm, look after our animals, and then also have this sort of broader responsibility of looking after the environment as well. One of the difficulties of farming is that there's inevitably some losses of greenhouse gas emissions. All organisms produce CO2 through a process called respiration. But that's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is plants taking CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, into their leaves, down into their roots, and then it eventually ends up going out into the soil. And so we have these two big processes going on at the same time. And a small difference between those two results in an accumulation of carbon in the soil or a loss of carbon from the soil. Our key job is to try and find ways to increase the amount that is captured and decrease the amount that is re-released back into the atmosphere. So when we think about this balance of carbon dioxide going down into the soil and being re-released, we have these two big processes of photosynthesis and this process of respiration. If a soil is bare, so there's no plants growing on it, what's now happened is you've reduced the capture of this carbon dioxide and you're reducing the amount that's entering into the soil. The microorganisms in the soil, they don't notice that. They keep decomposing or breaking down the carbon that is in the soil and re-releasing it into the atmosphere. So when you think about a bare soil, you've effectively stopped that carbon dioxide being captured and put into the soil, but the microorganisms are continuing to pump out CO2. So avoiding soils being bare, not having active photosynthesizing plants on them, is something that you should absolutely look to do. Another way that we're exploring is whether there are different plant species that we can add into the pasture mix that will have more or different kind of roots penetrating through the soil and increasing the carbon content of the soil. We've been looking at things like plantain, chicory, tall fescue, and it's really probably going to be about what plants are best where. It's early days yet, but there is some promising leads that increasing the diversity of pastures can increase the amount of carbon in soil. In New Zealand, we're really lucky because we've got really forgiving soils, we have year-round growth, a great climate. And so what has happened is that we've built up large amounts of carbon in our soils in comparison to many other countries. Additionally, we tend to farm in a way that there's always vegetation on the surface and we're not continuously cropping large areas. As a result, we've got really large amounts of carbon in most of our soils around New Zealand. So it could be quite hard to increase the amount of carbon that you have in your soil. There are practices out there that might be able to help, and those practices will not only benefit the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere and increase the amount of carbon that's in soil, but if you can increase the amount of carbon or actually just maintain what you've got in your soils, then you've got a healthier soil, and that's going to support the vegetation above it better. It's going to have better environmental outcomes. It might make that soil more resilient to external disturbances like perhaps droughts or other kinds of disturbances. So keeping the amount of carbon that you have in your soil is simply good farming practice.
So the aim is to draw carbon into our soil and keep it there. But New Zealand's soils are already naturally high in carbon, so adding more is a lot harder than in some other parts of the world. And even though we grow a lot of grass, that doesn't tell us our soil carbon is increasing. In fact, latest data suggests it's been steady at best in flatland and declining in peat soils. It seems to have increased in hill country soils, but we don't know if that's continuing. So what's important right now is holding on to the soil carbon that we have. There's lots of research underway to explore how we can do this. It's looking at actions like avoiding bare soils and planting diverse pastures to find out how they affect soil carbon under New Zealand's different farm types and physical environments. You can find out more on this research and New Zealand's soil carbon levels on the Ag Matters website. Check it out.